Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about mercantilism and the commercial revolution. So you can see in our SOL below that is what we are discussing and how it applies to trade after 1500. So let's get started. So mercantilism. Mercantilism developed around 1500 and was an economic practice that lasted until about 1750. You can see the political cartoon beside mercantilism, and we'll explain that and talk about it a little bit after we go through this slide. So, like I said, mercantilism was an economic practice, and it was a driving factor behind the age of exploration and colonialism. So it was a major influence on these countries, these European countries, exploring and trying to colonize new lands. So let's look at why that is. So what is mercantilism? Like we said, it's an economic practice, and it was used by colonial powers or European countries who were trying to colonize other places to become self-sufficient. So it was an economic practice used by colonial powers to become self-sufficient countries. And by self-sufficient, we mean that they can rely solely on themselves for providing everything they need to their citizens and to their country. So we talked about in our last year, or in earlier in this in our last video about Japan and China both becoming isolated economies or isolated countries. They were practicing isolationism, and that's because they decided they could be self-sufficient. They could exist and prosper as a country without importing any other goods from other places, without needing the ideas or the practices or the technology from other places. They could live and sustain themselves and their country and prosper on their own. So that is the idea behind mercantilism, is that these European countries were trying to become self-sufficient in that way. And they were going to do that in a couple different ways. One, they were going to use those colonies that they were finding and claiming for themselves. They're going to use those colonies to provide for them so they could be self-sufficient. And also the wealth that they did get, they were going to keep within the borders of their countries. So these countries were trying to get as much gold and silver, actual hard, sorry about the bell, guys. So they were going to use that gold and silver that they were getting from their colonies and getting from trading, and they were going to keep that within the borders to make sure that their country stayed wealthy and that the wealth they were gaining stayed within their country. So that's what the retention of wealth means there. And again, like I said, they're also going to do this by relying and using those colonies. So let's take a look at how they were doing that. So the role the colonies played in mercantilism. These colonial powers, these European countries who had colonies, believed that their colonies existed for the sole benefit of the mother country. So England believed that its colonies in North America, along the east coast of North America, existed for the sole benefit of England. That's how these countries saw their colonies. And what that means is that they were going to provide, those colonies were going to provide for the mother country. And they did this by exporting to their mother country raw materials. So like we talked about all the cotton that was coming from those colonies in North America, the sugar, furs, anything, the gold that was coming from the colonies in South America to Spain, any natural resources, those raw materials that were harvested or collected or grown in those colonies was going to go back to the mother country. So they were providing natural resources. They provided land. They could grow things on that land, and it expanded their territorial gains, their actual land holdings, to make them more powerful. So it gave them land. It also gave them workers. There are people living on that land and working for the mother country. All of these things were things that the colonies provided for the mother country. And the last thing is competition. Colonies could not compete with their mother country. This means that the colonies in North and South America, they provided things to the mother country and only to the mother country. They couldn't produce things to trade or sell to other countries that would compete with the trading of their mother country. It also meant that anything that those colonies needed, they had to get from the mother country. So if settlers in North America, along the eastern coast of North America, needed anything, needed
clothes or goods or anything manufactured, weapons and tools, anything like that that they couldn't make themselves, they had to get it from their mother country, from England. So England was the only person that they could trade with and buy from. And America also couldn't make factories to start producing their own things or producing things to trade, because that would compete with the mother country, and that was against mercantilism. So that, in a nutshell, is the idea of mercantilism, an economic practice to make European countries or those colonial powers self-sufficient by using their colonies to do so, and they're keeping wealth within their borders. So you see above this political cartoon, the mother country, she's super wealthy, she has all the wealth to herself, and she's being served by the colonies. Colonies, I mean, are gold and silver, food that they've grown there, and raw materials, and she's being served by the colonies. The colonies are there for her benefit. So this is another example, another image that you can use to think about mercantilism. You see on the left, the mother country's treasury is full of gold and silver. Like I said, they're keeping that wealth within their border. The middle says a balance of trade, and how they wanted the balance of trade is that they didn't have any imports coming in, very few imports coming in, and they had a lot of exports going out. If you're sending out a lot of materials, you're gaining a lot of wealth for yourself, you're building the wealth of your country, and if you have few imports coming in, that means you don't need things from other countries. We said mercantilism is a goal of being self-sufficient, not needing things from other people. And then last, you see the mother country is getting gold and silver and fur and food stuff and lumber from their colonies, and they're sending manufactured goods back to the colonies, making their colonists buy things from the mother country. So just another visual for you. Now, let's talk about the commercial revolution. This lasted from about 1520 to about 1650. And it was let's talk about how it started first. So the motivation for exploration was monetary, meaning money. These colonial powers, the countries that were going out, sending explorers out, trying to establish colonies, were doing so to gain wealth. They wanted to become more powerful, and they were going to become more powerful by building their economies and gaining a lot of wealth. So that was the motivation behind exploration. And because of this need or this want of these countries to be gaining wealth and exploring these new places and establishing colonies, it created competition among European powers. So that is how competition, or why competition was really heating up between these European powers. And they were competing for three things. Overseas markets. So they were trying to find overseas markets to trade and sell goods. So they wanted to establish these markets, like think of Portugal with their ports that they established along the coast of Africa and into India. They were establishing these ports, and they wanted to be the ones controlling these ports so that they could trade goods, they could sell their own goods, sell exports to these people, but also buy the goods that they needed. They wanted to control those trades. They also wanted resources. So those colonies they were finding were so that they could get natural resources, gold, silver, along with food supplies, lumber, things like that that would be valuable to the mother country and that the mother country could use, and they wouldn't have to buy from someone else. And lastly, for colonies themselves, they were competing to establish these colonies. They were racing against each other to be the first one to find the new land, establish themselves as a presence there, and really claim that territory for themselves so they could get more gold, more silver, more natural resources from them. So that's the competition of it. And because of this, it starts the commercial revolution, which is where, because of all these factors, new economic systems begin to emerge. There are two that we're going to talk about in particular. The first is money and banks. So currencies start to establish. In the United States, we have the dollar. In the European Union, they have the euro. In Mexico, they have the peso. These are all established currencies that everyone in that country, everyone in that area uses. Everyone uses those same currencies. Well, that started to happen for these European countries during the commercial revolution. And there was, people trusted that money. They trusted that that piece of money was worth what it was worth, and it was going to stay that way so they could use it to buy other things. And also banks. So we talked about with the Reformation, usury becoming an acceptable practice now. And so banks and people were starting, banks are established and people are starting to lend money. People need money to do all of these explorations, to fund these explorations. And so banks are established to lend people money. That's a new system that starts to develop and emerge. And with that, things called joint stock companies exist. So these joint stock companies are companies that go out and they find investors. So each one of you in our class, say, would invest money in the joint stock company, and the joint stock company would pool all of our money together and fund an exploration. And if that exploration was profitable, if it made a profit, then each one of us would get a profit, a piece of that profit, because we were investors in that joint stock company. Two important ones are the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company that pooled together wealth to fund these explorations. And last, mercantilism, practices such as mercantilism, these new economic practices and ideas that motivated and drove the economic policies of these countries forward. And lastly, important consequence or important thing to remember with the commercial revolution is that colonial economies were limited because of the needs of mother countries. The colonial economies were there solely to support their mother country, and because of this, their needs, their economic needs were put second. And so that limited the development of those colonial economies. They were limited by their mother countries. So that is the commercial revolution and mercantilism in a nutshell. We will start our new unit on Unit 6 tomorrow night.